In this video, we're going to look at the unusual life of one of the sons of Graaff Reinet. Bill Meadway was born in 1852, and because he was more or less the same age as my great-grandfather, Johnny Hobson, the two became friends. Bill, it would appear, in his late 20s or early 30s, left Graaff Reinet, went up north to seek his fortune. And on a day in early 1896, Johnny happened to be on the station, at the station on the platform, and who should he see there but Bill Meadway? So he said to him, "Hello, Bill. A long time since we've seen each other. Where have you been and what have you been doing?" So Bill said to him, "Well, I participated in the Jamison raid, and as you know, they arrested all of us. But they've only kept the officers for trial. They released the rest of us. And so now I need to decide what I'm going to do, where to go and what to do. I've come home to Graaff Reinet to come and say hello to my mum. But after that, I need to decide what I'm going to do." So Johnny said to him, "Well, Bill, once you've seen your mother, come out to the farm, come to Sherlands, and come and spend some time with us. Then you can think about while you're thinking about where you want to go, you can be on the farm with us." And so Bill duly did that, and he came to Sherlands and he spent some time thinking about what he wanted to do. And after a few weeks and months, he decided that he was going to stay. And Bill stayed for nearly 40 years on the farm at Sherlands. And this is the story about his life and who his parents were, what they did, where they lived, and Bill himself and his life up north, and then joining the Hobson family at Sherlands. So Bill decided to stay at Sherlands, and he was a bachelor for his whole life, and he lived on the farm and tended the extensive orchard of fruit trees and the large garden that they had on the farm. Of course, they didn't have refrigeration in those days, and it was far to town, so they basically grew everything that they needed. And so Bill looked after that garden. Now, Bill Meadway's father was also called Bill. He was William. He was born in London, and he came to South Africa. It seems that they came sometime after the 1820 settlers, because it was sometime before 1850. In 1850, he married Mary Ann Watson in Grahamstown. And on the marriage certificate, the occupation that is written down for Bill is as a merchant. So that's what Bill did. We don't know whether he was a shopkeeper or whether he was a traveling trader, but he was put down as being a merchant. At some point, the family moved to Graaff Reinet. We're not sure when that is. The next date that we have is a trophy that was won by Bill. Bill must have been quite a good marksman, because he won the trophy for archery in 1878. So we know that by that time they were in Graaff Reinet. We take it that the trophy that he received was here, because in Graaff Reinet at that time there was an archery club. It was situated, together with some other sports, cricket and so on, it was situated in the enclosed within the race course, the horse racing course. And in an early William Rowe photograph, you can see the round track that the horses raced on just south of town. And if you go there today, it was first of all the showgrounds. That's where the horse track was. So in other words, just other side the river, but short of the railway line. And today there are various buildings there, including the detective branch of the police. That's the part of town where the archery club was, and that's where Bill won the archery prize in 1878. At some time after 1878 and before 1895, Bill, as we mentioned, he worked his way up north to Rhodesia. And in Rhodesia was a company that had been floated by Cecil John Rhodes called the British South Africa Company. And there was no state police force in Rhodesia at that time, but the company enrolled policemen. They were called members of the British South Africa Police. That was the title given to them. And I will, from now on, I will refer to the BSAP. When I'm talking about the BSAP, I'm referring to the British South Africa Police. The British South Africa Police were part policeman, part soldier. Each man had been was trained to do the duties of a policeman, but also to act as an army. The soldiers, to be a soldier and act as an army. And so the Matabele Wars were from 1893 onwards, and Cecil John Rhodes requested that the BSAP take on more recruits, possibly to make their numbers strong enough to deal with the Matabele. But so it would appear that Bill volunteered for the BSAP at that sort of time. And the British South Africa Police earned themselves a very good name in their conduct during the war. They were a very efficient fighting force. So let's just talk for a moment about William Meadway Sr. William Meadway, as we mentioned, he lived in Graaff Reinet. We don't know what he did, whether he was a shopkeeper but we know from Grahamstown that he was listed as a merchant. That's very possible that he was some kind of trader or shopkeeper. And then, interestingly, on his death certificate, he is recorded he died, let me find the place here, he died in 1884 at Kendrew. That's what his death certificate says. And then, if we look at the history books, we know that the railway line from Port Elizabeth to Graaff Reinet was only opened in 1879. So at some point in the first 5 years of the existence of that little station, he set up as a shopkeeper there. So one wonders why a man, not a young man, he was already fairly elderly then, would uproot from Graaff Reinet and go to Kendrew. What were the opportunities that drew him to that little hamlet? I'm saying a hamlet was actually just a station on a piece of bare earth. If you have a look at the pictures from that sort of time, you'll see that there was a station and very little else. So Bill Meadway was operating a shop at Kendrew at the time that he died. Kendrew was a little station, and it was only after 1925, when the Graaff Reinet Dam was built, were the Kendrew irrigated land scheme did that get off the ground. So, then there were many settlers that came to Kendrew area. But before that, it was really just a very small place. And you wonder why William Meadway would have gone there. And perhaps it had to do with the saloon in the dining car of the train, because I understand that was the one activity that happened at Kendrew. I grew up on the farm Rooiberg, and from Rooiberg you can look down on Kendrew, and you can see sort of from high up, you can see what's going on. And my dad told me that in the early days, the people living at Rooiberg, I suppose they would have been McFarlanes or Holmeses, after the railway line was built, they would observe from the mountain, more or less at the time that the train pulled into the station, there would be many little clouds of dust on the roads coming towards Kendrew, because they would come there to get drink from the saloon in the dining car. Well, perhaps during those visits to the dining car, the patrons of William Meadway Sr. would have had some time and some money to visit his shop. Perhaps that's the explanation. We now come to the part of the life of Bill Meadway where he participated in the Jameson raid. And there are two things that I have to say before we really get into the topic. And the first is that although the story has been handed down to me from my dad about Bill Meadway and about him being part of the Jameson raid, I've not been able to confirm in any documentation that he in fact was on the raid. I can't understand why he would tell an untruth, but I can't find any record of him being on the raid. But I accept that he was, and for the purposes of this story, we will assume that Bill really was on that raid. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, in relation to the Jameson raid, I'm indebted to Martin Kramer of the YouTube channel 5 Romeo Romeo. I suggest that if you're interested in anything to do with the Rhodesian Armed Forces, that you have a look at his channel. He gives a very good description of what happened with the Jameson raid, and so I'm indebted to him for the facts and also for some of the visuals. While I'm busy doing the acknowledgements, let me also thank Laura Clue. Laura, besides being one of my favorite nieces, is a very accomplished genealogist, and she was being most helpful in looking up and finding out about Bill Meadway and his parents. So Laura, thank you for that. As we look at the Jameson raid and we look at the reasons for it, we find them in the formation of the Transvaal Republic. The Transvaal Boers declared themselves a republic in 1852, and it was a poor country. They weren't wealthy, but they were very happy because they had finally got far enough away from the British. So they practiced their own particular, quite strict brand of Calvinism, and they were able to conduct their livestock farming in the Transvaal, and they were free to do so under their own terms, and they were very happy with that. But then in 1884, gold was discovered on the Witwatersrand, and that changed everything because people from around the world came to Johannesburg, as it became known, this little mining town that sprang up and quickly grew to an enormous size. And the conditions in Johannesburg were not wonderful, particularly the women and children of the Uitlanders. That was the people that had come from England and America and elsewhere, the Outlanders. The conditions of the women and children was not good. Also, the Uitlanders had no vote in the Transvaal. So the Boers were very happy to have the extra income that came from the revenue, the taxes on the gold, but they didn't want to give any of these people the vote. And so there was quite some dissatisfaction about this. They formed a committee, the Reform Committee, the Uitlanders, and this committee went to meet the Boers, met the president, and the president simply said, yes, we'll help you, of course we'll help you, but they never did. And so into this whole mix, of course, was Cecil John Rhodes. Cecil John Rhodes, as we know, as we've learned from history, had a great ambition to be able to travel all the way from the Cape to Cairo and to do so on British soil the whole way. So he wanted the Transvaal for Britain. And so he urged his lieutenant, Leander Starr Jameson, to form up a force, and they were then going to coordinate with some of the Uitlanders. They were going to smuggle arms, rifles, to the Uitlanders in Johannesburg. And the Uitlanders themselves had decided that the staatsartillery, the state artillery in Pretoria, was not well guarded, and so that they would attack and seize the artillery pieces so that the Boers would be denied that bit of force in any conflict that might arise. So that then Jameson asked for volunteers from the BSAP, the Defence Force really of Rhodesia, and they got some 300 or more volunteers, and these men were moved to a spot on the Botswana or Bechuanaland border, as it was called, Bechuanaland in those days, Botswana now, moved to a spot on that border, a little place called Pitsani, which is about the nearest spot that you can get to Johannesburg from Bechuanaland. This Pitsani was a staging post. It had been put in place there to provide fresh mules for the stagecoach. The stagecoach ran from Mafeking to Bulawayo. There was no railway line in those days. The railway line from the Cape ended at Mafeking. If you wanted to get to Bulawayo, you had to do so on your own horse, or you had to take a stagecoach. Stagecoaches were imported from America, and they look exactly like the stagecoaches that we as children saw in the Western movies. So it was a conveyance carrying about 12 people. About half of those would sit on the roof, and it was drawn by mules, and it travelled day and night. So they would swap the drivers and the mules at these stage posts along the way, of which Pitsani was one. So it would take about 6 or 10 days, depending on how muddy the road was and how many rivers were in flood, to travel from Mafeking to Bulawayo. So just a little way off from the main road, this camp was set up, put up tents, and all these soldiers came there, and they were paraded and given practice shooting their rifles. And the story was put out. If any of the travellers heard a bugle blowing or heard shots being fired, the story was put out that this was a force that was being put together by Cecil John Rhodes to guard the railway line. They said Cecil John Rhodes is going to build a railway line from Botswana to Bulawayo, which was in fact the truth. It's something that did happen afterwards, but the story was put out that these soldiers were there. They were being trained to guard the railway line. In the meanwhile, back at Johannesburg, the Reform Committee were not in unity. Many of them didn't really have the stomach for an armed uprising, and so some messages were sent through to Jameson: look, we're not ready for you, don't come. But the messages that did get to him were either not very clear, or he didn't understand them properly, and so he was in a very tight position, because the longer he stayed with this large force on the border of the Transvaal, the more chance there was that the Boers would learn of this thing. And so he was very antsy, very keen to get going, to start this horse ride, the 3-day horse ride to Johannesburg. So on the afternoon of the 28th, he sent off a telegram from Pitsani to Rhodes in Cape Town. It said, if by 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, that will be the 29th, we haven't heard from you, then we're going to leave. And of course, Rhodes never got the telegram. So they left late afternoon on the 29th, and they rode overnight and arrived the next morning at a little place called Otto's Whoop, where they were joined by a contingent from the Bechuanaland police force. Just over 100 volunteers from that force joined them. So they had just over 500 soldiers that were part of this force. And they then hastened on their route towards Johannesburg. But the following day, they began to realize that they were being shadowed by Boers. There were Boers riding along, flanking them out of rifle shot, but observing them and watching them go. So they knew that their presence was known. The Boers, in their turn, had sent messages forward, and a large Boer force was gathering at Krugersdorp. So the Jameson force, actually one of the Boer generals, I think it was Louis Botha, the young Louis Botha, sent to them a message saying, you are illegally in this country, turn around and go back. We will not molest you as long as you leave. Well, Jameson didn't pay any attention to that. He carried on. Remember that Jameson felt that he was on a rescue mission. He was going to rescue Uitlanders, women and children. So he then continued eastwards towards Johannesburg, and the next day, the 31st, or the first, probably the first it was, they met quite a large force at Krugersdorp, and they were unable to force their way through, and so they were diverted southwards. They hoped to kind of get round them and still get to Joburg, but they were diverted southwards. And then the next day, this very tired, very sleepless and hungry force of Jameson was cornered at a place called Doornkop, and they were outnumbered, so Jameson surrendered, and all the soldiers were taken prisoner. The leaders, Jameson himself and his officers, were all kept in prison to await trial, but the rank and file, like Bill Meadway, were taken to the border of the Transvaal and released into the care of the British authorities there. And it is in that way that Bill got on a train and came to Graaff Reinet. Now he joined, so he went to Sherlands, and he joined Johnny and Ivy Hobson with their fairly small children. The children were still young. They had 5 children at that stage, and so there were still 2 more boys that were born. My grandfather Robert was born in 1897, and his younger brother Harry was born in 1899. So Bill Meadway arrived at a time when when the family was still very young, and so he was really absorbed into the family. He lived in the house. There was a special room. I'll show you a picture depicting where Bill lived during his time, his nearly 40 years at Sherlands. There was one room that was allocated to him, and so he was there. He would have shared meals with the family, and they would have grown up around him. So the next time that we sort of have an event in the Hobson family is when war breaks out in 1914, and there are an armed band of rebels, Boer rebels, in the Northern Cape. And so Norman, the eldest son, is dispatched together with a force. They go by train up to the Northern Cape, and in one of the very first skirmishes, he is shot. He's shot. The news, when it came back to Sherlands, had Johnny was so distressed about the death of his son that he had a stroke. And when he had partially recovered from his stroke, he found that he was no longer able to conduct his farming. And so in 1914, the second youngest son was still at school, Robert. He was still at school, but he was extracted from St. Andrew's College. He was 16 years old. He was extracted from school. He didn't finish his schooling career, and he came back to come and help run the farms. Ivy, the wife of Johnny, was in her own right a very competent farmer, and I'm sure Bill would have lent a hand as well. Besides looking after the garden, he would have also done some sheep work. So young Robert was at a very early age put to work to look after the farms. In 1923, Johnny Hobson died. He died then. And in the same year, Robert married a young nurse from the Midland Hospital called Dorothy Cornby. And to them, a son was born, Brian, that's my father, was born in 1925. And then it appears that Dorothy had some trouble after that. She did not have another baby until 1932, when young Brian was 7 years old. He got a sister called Pam. Very sadly, Dorothy didn't survive the birth, in that within 2 or 3 weeks after the birth, she herself died. And so Robert, the young father, was left with a 2 or 3 week old infant and a 7-year-old son. And he turned immediately to his aunt, who was Mary. Mary was the elder, one of the older sisters, she had married Archibald McNaughton and lived at Belmont, and she had raised her youngest daughter, Mary, was just about due to be weaned, and so she was the nurse and raised and provided milk for Pamela. So it was a very lonely time, I think, for Brian, my father, and he had been very close to his mother. You can see that in the picture of the two of them together. And this is when Bill did something wonderful. He made it his job to entertain this young boy of an evening, to tell him stories and to be his confidant. So Brian was then of an evening would go to Bill's room and be entertained with stories, and have somebody that he could tell his troubles to. The young boy could relate to somebody in a close way after his mother died. And so Bill stayed on at Sherland's until he was well into his 80s in 1934, more or less at the time that Robert remarried. He married Elizabeth van Niekerk. So when Robert remarried, then more or less at that time, Bill left the farm and came to live in Graaff Reinet. And he eventually died, I think at the age of 87 in 1939. So he lived to ripe old years, and he really was a singular man. My dad tells how he was a real old-timer, when everybody else was already using a fountain pen. Bill, if he wanted to write a letter, would go down to the chicken run. My dad tells me, he told me that he would go to the chicken run and look for a suitable feather, bring it home and get out his penknife and trim it till it was of the right shape, and then he would write his letter. So he says that he was a wonderful man, a real old-timer, and somebody who my dad was very, very fond of. And I just want to stop here. And so, when he was buried in the St. James Church Cemetery. And I know that when my dad was old, he often would think about Bill and think about what Bill had done for him as a child. And I know that he went and searched through that cemetery until he found Bill's grave, and he's the one who put flowers on the grave for Bill. So that's the story of Bill Meadway. As I said, I think that he was somebody from a time before most of the people that we know. He lived mostly in the latter part of the 1800s, having participated in the Jameson raid. He was obviously a very adventurous young man, and then, that he should be happy to settle down and serve one family for nearly 40 years as their gardener, and live as a member of the household. Really a rather singular and very special man. So that's the story about Bill Meadway. Thank you.